Thanks, Adam. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I just want to say thank you to the team who led us in worship, Meg. I go to lots of churches, and it looks like sometimes that people aren't enjoying themselves very much, but you look like you're enjoying yourself. You look like you're inviting us into the presence of God. So it's fantastic, and so good on you. And we need more of that in our churches. Part of my role at the Baptist Union Victoria, and part of one of the ministries that we have in the BUV Support Hub is called an RMF. An RMF is a Rural Ministers Fellowship. So basically what we do around different corners of the state is a group of us from our staff team will go and we'll collect country, rural, regional pastors together, and we'll spend 3 days with them. We'll do some leadership development, we'll do some workshops, we'll do some just have some meals, bit of fellowship, and we usually have one excursion where we do something sort of leisurely or a bit of fun, and depending on the age of the group, how much leisure and fun it is. And so it's interesting what we have. Sometimes we just walk around a lake. That's about as much fun as some people can cope with in some place. One time we visit the RAF site in Sale, and got a whole tour of the whole facility. That was pretty good. About 18 months ago or so, we were up in the southwest, and the regional pastor had organised us to go and visit a local dairy farm. Now, I've been in plenty of dairy farms in my day, and I thought, okay, I wasn't overly excited. I'm going to get, you're going to get the tour of the dairy farm, a lot of poo, a lot of mud, a lot of smells, and okay, I get the scene, what's going to happen here. So I thought, but I'm here, I'm with the crowd, I've got to go along and be part of it. So I went along, and we're all there, and before we got the tour of the operations, the farmer sat us down and he says, look, I just want to tell you a bit about the farm and about the story of my farm. And as it turned out, this was an organic dairy farm, so it wasn't just any ordinary dairy farm. And he told us all about his dairy farm, and then towards the end of it, he said that he's got a 50-year vision for his farm. And he started to tell us about his vision. And once he finished telling us about his 50-year vision, somebody asked the question and said, how did you come up with a 50-year vision? And then he told the story of the farm's history. He told us that his grandfather had migrated to Australia in the 70s from Germany, and he bought this little plot of land out there in the southwest of Victoria. But he spent all his money on the land, and he didn't have enough money to adopt traditional farming methods. And so he did a little bit of organic farming in Germany, and so he decided that he would make it an organic dairy farm. And so he started working this organic dairy farm, and he was really working in that time of starting something, of innovating something, of establishing something. It's a lot of hard, back-breaking work, and he was doing all of that. Then in the late 70s, there was a bit of a crisis in the dairy industry, as this farmer was telling us, that cheeses were being imported to Australia from Europe, and it was a bit of a rocked the sort of dairy industry a little bit here in Australia. But this farmer, he'd come from Europe, he'd made cheese before in Europe, and so he pivoted a bit and he started making organic cheese as well. And so that was the first part of the establishment part of the story of the farm, where they were setting things up and sort of getting things going. And then it came time for his grandfather to hand the farm over to his son. And he handed over a farm that was just surviving, week to week, month to month, year to year. It was established, but it wasn't a real going concern. And so the father who inherited the farm, he then got to work on making this not just a survival business, but a thriving business. And so he then started to, after a while, to enlarge the footprint of the farm, buy more surrounding farmland, so that they could rest some of the paddocks, so that they could get more cows, so they can produce more milk and all that type of stuff. And then he decided that also he needed to be a little more efficient in the techniques, and so started investing in technology. And pretty much by the time he came to hand the farm over to his son, the farm was thriving, a thriving business and a thriving farm. And the farmer, the current farmer, who had really just taken the farm the last few years, he said, when I think about my 50-year vision. The way I know how to go forward is by looking at what's happened here in these last 50 years. It was 50 years old, that farm. And he said, I look at my grandfather and I look at the resilience. I look at the risks he took. I look at the entrepreneurship that he had. I look at how he sort of was able to take on a crisis and react and pivot, if you like, into something else. And I learn about that, and I want to take that into the future. And then I look at my dad and I look at how he invested in the footprint, how he didn't just keep things going the way they were going, and he invested in technology, and he sort of grew the business. And so when I look forward, I got a little bit of a blueprint for the way forward, and I want to take risks. I want to be entrepreneurial. I want to be able to adapt when the challenges come. But I also need to invest. I need to buy more land. I need to sort of get more efficient in our technology and the way we go about things. And so there's my 50-year vision. Now, he was much more inspirational when he told the story, but it was interesting. There was about 3 or 4 of our staff in that, listening to that before. That was before we did and walked through all the mud and everything. That was next. But we came away from that pretty inspired by this guy's story. And we said to each other, you know what? We need a 50-year vision. We need a 50-year vision. Now, why do we need a 50-year vision? Well, based on the farmer's story, you see, it provides a clear direction and it helps decision making. It provides inspiration and motivation, something to aspire to. It helps anticipate trends and challenges. It instills resilience and sustainability in the midst of challenging and tough times. It encourages alignment and collaboration and partnerships with others to get to the goal that you need to get to. And it aims at legacy and impact. That's what it does. It says, hey, this is going to go beyond me. It's going to go into the next generation and into the next generation. And we're going to hand something on that is viable and sustainable and that is positive. But the thing is, that's all well and good, why we need one, but how do we know what is ahead? It's pretty hard to know what's going to happen next week, let alone next year, let alone 50 years' time from now. Well, the farmer was able to sort of not tell us what's ahead, but could figure out some of the challenges that would lie ahead based on what was behind. And the Bible's very, very good at this in telling us how to think about what's ahead, constantly encouraging us to remember what has happened already, how God has already been at work in our lives. We sang that song, Same God. It's that sort of same sentiment there that the Bible often tells us. Remember the things of the former days, remember what's happened in the past, how God has been at work. And in Jeremiah 29, we've got a similar thing actually going on. In Jeremiah 29, we have God's people who are in captivity in Babylon. They're in exile. It's a terrible, terrible situation. And this passage, we know it very well. And what's happening before this passage, the context is they're in exile, and God says through the prophet, you're actually not going to be out of here in very soon. You're going to be here for a long, long, long time. So settle down, get married, build houses, do all that sort of stuff, right? But there is going to be a way out. There is going to be a future for her. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. There is a way out. You do have a future. It's not the end of the story. Now, the word he uses for future there is a very interesting word. It comes from the word aharit. Aharit literally means going backwards, going forwards, if you like, backwards, forward, backwards. So it's basically like that rower. They're going forward, but they're facing backwards. And the way they're able to go straight, the way they're able to get to the destination they need to get to is because as they look back, they have an anchor point, something to fix their eyes on that helps them move into the direction that they need to go. And that's pretty much what the prophet is telling these folks while they're in exile. Hey, you have a future, you will get there, but in order to get there, you need to look back. You need to look back at the mighty acts of God. You need to look back how God has been at work in our story. and hold on to that and believe that. Don't want to go back there, but use it to inspire you to go forward. And so we look back to go forward. And so the question that we asked ourselves in the BV Support Hub is, where have we been? What is our story? And our story is an amazing, amazing story. Way back in 1838, a group of 16 Baptist people gathered for the very first time in a tent in what is now known as the Regent Theatre, and they had their first Baptist worship service in Victoria. I think it was still New South Wales then. That's what happened way back, 1838. 5 years later, 1843, the church was constituted, moved across the road to a place called Collins Street Baptist that we know today. The very first church, Baptist church here in Victoria. And then from there though, what happened is that we had different things started to occur throughout Victoria. We had this era of the pioneers where people started to sort of branch out from the central part of the city and start to explore the broader area of Victoria. And as they did so, they started to form little communities outside of the city centre. And as they formed little communities, churches were planted in those communities as people gathered to worship. And then we had the era of the gold rush, where people from all over Australia, indeed all over the world, flocked to Victoria, place Ballarat, Bendigo, Ararat, all those sorts of places. And there were thousands and thousands of people, and little communities of faith started to pop up there, and churches were planted in those particular areas. And then we have the era of agriculture, where people went out to places like Kerrang and Boort and Barraboot and sort of out to the Mallee areas and started farming. And then we have little churches, and we have Baptist churches in those places to this very, very day. And then we have the era of manufacturing, back into the city centres, back into the regions. People start making things, more and more people gathering, and churches being planted and established in those places. And then in the first 100 years, as we wrap up the first 100 years, we have the era of suburban extension, where the suburbs people start moving out into the suburbs. And you go and you continue on. And we have today, probably another 70, 80 years, the continual of the urban extension and regional extension, and indeed also migration, amazing migration, people coming to this country from all over the world and gathering all sorts of places. And in what were years ago, just not so long ago, it seemed like paddocks are now whole communities that are there. So it continues to happen. Now, what happened here in all this, in this time, as all these things happened? Well, it seems that the church went where the need was. It went where people sort of started together. And in fact, this church is here. It's here because somebody came here. Somebody came and said, "There's people gathering in this place, in this region, in the northern sort of like inner north of Melbourne, and we need some churches in this place and this space." And then, of course, throughout our history, Baptists have responded to need, aged care, theological education, leadership development, mission, all different agencies that we have that started out of the need that has occurred. And so, when we ask the question. Where could we be? Where have we been? That's our story. That's the inspiration, if you like. That's how God has been at work in our movement. It's been a multiplication movement. It's been a church planting movement when you think about our history. So the question is, where could we be in 50 years? Well, let's think about a few things about when it comes to where could we be. The population of Victoria is rapidly growing. We've got incredible migration, haven't we? We're estimated to be 8 million people by 2033. That's less than 8 years away. Imagine what it's going to be in 50 years' time. They reckon over at least 12 million. We want to actually help people encounter Jesus, make disciples, and bring transformation to this state. But we can't really reach 12 plus million people with 250 churches. It's what we got now. 250 churches. Well, if all our churches, 250 churches, became mega churches, maybe, but not everybody likes going to a mega church, so that might not work. But the footprint of most of our Baptist churches probably wouldn't allow that to actually happen. So we're probably in a bit of strife there. We're going to need some more churches. We have a bold vision to double our churches and dream of new expressions of churches right throughout Victoria. We want to see all our churches multiply. Now, that's not humanly possible in many ways, is it? To do this. We can't do this in our own strength. And I'm pretty sure that 16 people meeting in a tent in the middle of the city, way back, 180 years ago or whatever, probably couldn't imagine 250 churches and 30-odd thousand people gathering as Baptists around Victoria. But we've got a God who can do immeasurably more than we ask or imagine. And so what seems to be something that's impossible is very, very possible for the God that we worship today. So the God who can take this one little tiny group of people has already brought us up to 250 churches. And we believe that he can take us easily to in 2075 to at least double that. And so our vision in Victoria for the next 50 years, if you like, is to be a union of 500, that's double the number we've got now, flourishing churches. Now, you've just got to understand that it's not just about the number. We want healthy, vibrant churches, flourishing churches who are able to sort of be the best expression of the local church they can possibly be in the area that God has placed them. And so we want to see 500 flourishing churches making disciples and forming Victoria. That's our vision. Now, the key point of reflecting on going back, if you like, or what we might call sacred memories, is to refresh our minds and our memories of the mighty acts of God. It's what the prophets were constantly telling God's people to do in the Old Testament, so that we are inspired and given courage to step into the future that God has for us. The mighty acts of God in the past are our anchor points to guide us forward. Now, that's true of organisations like the Baptist Union of Victoria. It's also true of a church like Essendon Baptist Community Church, and indeed for each and every one of us as followers of Jesus. And it's always been true for Christians. And indeed, the Apostle Paul addresses this particular issue, this truth, with the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 15, where he says to them, "Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labour in the Lord is not in vain." Let me give you a bit of context in relation to what's actually going on here. The anchor point that Paul is pointing the Corinthians to is he's saying to them, you need to reflect on the resurrection of Christ. You see, in chapter 15, the basic issue that they were arguing about, that Paul is addressing, is that some Christians in that community were arguing against the bodily resurrection of the dead. And the Apostle Paul is writing to them, seeking to correct their false doctrine by reminding the Corinthians of the greatest sacred memory of all, the gospel, the death and resurrection of Jesus. The argument that he puts to them in the whole chapter basically goes like this: the death, burial and resurrection of Christ is the foundation for Christian faith. It is our anchor point, right? It is our anchor point, the ultimate sacred memory for us. The resurrection of Christ guarantees the resurrection of believers. We gain a resurrection body, so he actually tackles the issue that they're arguing about. And this is the more important thing for us to worry about, we are resurrection people. We are resurrection people. In other words, we have victory over death. There is hope in the midst of hopelessness. We're not doomed and stuck somewhere. So he says, therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labour is not in vain. Let me break that down for you just a little more so that you can understand this. Paul anchors his appeal. He anchors his appeal in the resurrection of Jesus. This sacred memory assures us of God's faithfulness and calls us to stand firm. The BV started with one tiny little church in the middle of our city. Fast forward 170, 180 years or so, we see that through the steadfast faith of churches and Christians standing firm through wars and depression, societal changes, and massive cultural upheaval, we are now a dynamic movement of more than 250 churches bringing hope and transformation to communities in pretty much every pocket of Victoria. Essendon Baptist Community Church has its own rich heritage of faithfulness in the vibrant inner northern community of Melbourne. The church's story is a powerful sacred memory. And of course, this church has the sacred memories of the Glenbervie Church, and it has the sacred memories of the Essendon Church, and then it has the memory of these churches becoming one step, the memory of the bold step of faith of merging the two churches, a decision that required both congregations to let go of familiar structures, to trust God's vision for something new, and to believe together that you could have a greater impact for the kingdom than you could alone. Through decades of ministry in this diverse and changing area, this church has remained anchored in the gospel and while adapting to serve new generations and different cultures. The founding members and those who have gone before us had vision and trusted God for big, big things in this community. Their faithfulness and perseverance laid the foundation for the welcoming, community-focused, mission-minded church that you are today. Individually, as followers of Jesus, we have our own stories, don't we? Stories of God breaking into our lives, our own sacred memories of conversion or of baptism, of healing, of breakthrough moments and times where we experience God's comfort, refuge and strength in the midst of grief and struggle and hardship. Friends, as followers of Jesus, we are gospel people. We are resurrection people. What does it mean to be resurrection people? We are people who live with the power and the hope that comes from Christ's victory over death. Because Jesus rose, we don't live in the fear of failure or loss. Because death has been defeated, we can take the risk for the kingdom. Because resurrection means God can bring new life from what looks dead. He can bring hope in the midst of hopelessness. We step forward with courage even when circumstances look impossible. We have a history of God's activity in our lives. We have a story, and we need to reflect on that story. In fact, reflect on the many stories that we have, because we don't just have one story, do we? We have many stories of God working in our lives. And let these stories strengthen our resolve to stand firm in our faith in the midst of the many, many challenges that we face today. In addition to standing firm, our sacred memories challenge us to engage in the present and invest in the future. I've been in pastoral ministry now, in pastoral leadership for around about 30 years now, nearly 14 as the Director of Mission Ministry at the Baptist Union Victoria. And I get around a lot these days, and I've seen some wonderful, wonderful churches doing amazing ministry and having a great impact in their communities. But unfortunately, this is probably why you don't want to follow me into this job, right? I've also had to deal with a lot of churches and a lot of Christian people who have become what you might say stuck, if you like. Stuck, probably a very nice way of saying it. And as a result, have experienced decline in numbers, in finances, and often in their own faith convictions. This happens, I think, not because people are bad people or terrible people, or because churches are not standing firm or remaining faithful. There's lots of reasons these things happen. There's conflict, there's grief, there's financial issues, there's a whole range of different things that happen. There's demographic shifts, these things happen, right? But one thing that I come across often, and it's repeated and repeated and repeated, is that often churches become stuck, not because of anything bad, but because of the great experience of God's presence in a particular time, in a particular era, a particular stage of the church's story. And because the experience is so good, people and churches, they want to stay in that space. They want to stay in that place. And as a result, they become stuck in that place. Now, what I'm talking about here is not, oh, that's terrible. What I'm talking about here is human nature. We all want to stay in those high moments, those great moments of our story, of our life. To live in places of comfort and certainty. That's natural, that's human. We all want that. But it's not necessarily helpful for advancing the gospel, indeed not even helpful for growing in our own faith journey. In Matthew chapter 17, we find what we know as the story of Jesus' transfiguration. Many of you would know this story. Jesus goes up to a mountain. He takes three of his disciples with him, Peter, James, and John, and they go up onto the mountain. And while he's up on the mountain, something amazing happens. Jesus is transfigured. That is, the glory of God is placed all on Jesus, and he glows. Like, it's just amazing. This is just an incredible experience. And to top it off, Moses and Elijah turn up for the spectacle and just join in the little party that's happening up here. Now, you've got three spectators here, Peter, James, and John. They're watching on, and they're just thinking, oh, how awesome is this? How awesome is this? And Peter, of course, says, how about we set up 3 tents? How about we set up camp on the mountain here? Because this is so good. We just need to camp up here for as long as possible. This is so good. You see, for them, the disciples, this was the pinnacle. This was the high point of their faith journey. And they wanted to stay there. But Jesus knew better. Instead, he says, no, we're gonna have to sort of leave the mountain, folks. And they leave the mountain, they go back into the valley, and they go back into a whole lot of mess, don't they? A terrible, terrible situation. A young fella possessed by a demon, and it goes through all the rigmarole of casting the demon out and all that stuff. You see, by wanting to set up camp on the mountain, the disciples wanted to do what many Christians, many churches have done over the years. Stay in the place where they thought they'd reached the pinnacle of their faith experience. But imagine if they stayed there. Imagine what they would have missed on the rest of their journey. Imagine the lessons they would have missed in relation to the rest of the journey that Jesus was taking with them to Jerusalem. Imagine they would have missed the death and the resurrection of Jesus, Pentecost and the filling of the Spirit, the birth of the church and their rise as leaders that would impact the church to this very day. When I think about this point in relation to the B of E 50-year vision, it highlights the need for me, yes, to celebrate the past and just say how awesome is that, but to move forward with courage and creativity, imagining what the church can become in a rapidly growing state and a changing world. The past is our blueprint for the future, but it's not a place we're meant to set up camp in. It inspires investment and initiatives in church planting, in multicultural ministry and community engagement. So for Essendon Baptist Community Church, there's a challenge here to always be thinking, like the farmer, about expanding your footprint, your missional footprint. Your own history demonstrates this beautifully. In the early 2000s, as I said before, Glenbervie Baptist could have remained comfortably in its spot right there. Essendon could have stayed right here in your separate camps. But you chose to step down from the individual mountains and merge into something new. And that took courage. It required leaving the familiar and stepping into uncharted territory. And was it messy when you got off the mountain? I know it was messy. It was messy, hey? Messy and painful and hard. But look at what God has done through that bold decision. You became something new, something different, better positioned to serve the diverse community in which God has placed you. Here In this diverse inner northern community with its mix of long-term residents, new migrant young families and established households, there are incredible opportunities. How can you advance the local community impact here? How can you build into the next generation of leadership and embrace the multicultural richness of Essendon and surrounding suburbs like Moonee Ponds and Aberfeldy and Strathmore? For all of us, as disciples, followers of Jesus, we are challenged not to settle and camp on our past or current experiences of God, but to step out in faith, believing that the God who gave us these experiences, the God who works so profoundly in our lives, is doing a new thing and wants us to step out and be part of the new thing that He's doing. And thirdly, our sacred memories provide a launch pad to step into the future. Now, this is in some ways a little similar to my second point, probably 2 points. Maybe I should have just had 2 points, but it's similar to my second point. But it just goes a little further, requiring us to live with resurrection power and not only think about the future, but to step into it boldly, to actually take some action. For the BUV, what that means is today prioritising church planting and discipleship. It means investing money in the right areas and having hard conversations with stuck churches. It means structuring our staff to serve our vision. For Essendon Baptist Community Church, you have a heritage of faithfulness in community engagement in this area. Throughout the church's history, there have been most likely, and as I sort of alluded to before, I think very true, times where the church has become stuck. Right? Every church has a history, and I reckon you could go to every church and find there were times in their story, in their journey, where they had become stuck. And it was a struggle. And they could go one way or the other. Now, fortunately, for this church, that is few and far between. You've not set up camp in a different era. You're moving forward. You know how to move forward as a people of faith. You've experienced that. You've done that. You've seen God's hand at work here. Now, friends, God is doing a new thing in this church, in this community. And my prayer is that the sacred memories, the great stories of God's incredible work and activity in the midst of this church, the rich history of this church will inspire you to embrace the new thing, to step out in faith, embrace new initiatives and advance the kingdom of God right here in the heart of Melbourne's inner north. I want to finish with a call to action. I'd like just for you to think about this, right? Just for each and every one of you to reflect on a way that God has worked in your life in the past. Just how has God worked at life? How has God impacted you, changed you? It might have been, your conversion. It might have been a sickness where He's healed or grief that was sort of comforted. Just think of a time that God has worked in your life, maybe inspired your faith and catalysed you forward. And this week, find somebody. It could be a spouse, could be a friend. Find somebody and share that story with them. But then go one step further and say, and that I think because of my story, because of the way God has been, I think God as I go forward wants me to do what? Think about how that story is a catalyst for the calling, for the next thing that God wants you to be engaged in. Secondly, ask yourself, is God asking you to play a part in the wider BUV vision, to be part of a church plant, to mentor a young leader, to serve in a church that is stuck, to give financially to a church plant or to advance God's kingdom in some way? Or does God want you to step up right here in this place, to serve here at Essendon Baptist, to help this church launch into God's desired future? How can you be part of reaching this broader, wider, diverse community, engaging with families, supporting new immigrants, connecting with young professionals, being salt and light in this corner of Melbourne? Above all, remember this: we are resurrection people. We have a hope. We have a future. We have a mission. And if we live with this disposition as resurrection people, not hopeless people, imagine the impact on the community, the state, the country. Imagine the lives changed, the churches planted, disciples made, new God moments we would experience. It would be so profound. It's possible because we're resurrection people. If we live with this 500 looks ridiculous, doesn't it? We should be, the Pentecostals want 1 million. I sort of look pretty like lack of faith. But let's start low. Let's start low. But that's what we're called to, isn't it? To be resurrection people. My prayer is that you embrace that. Be all that God wants you to be. Would you pray with me? God, we do thank you for the story that we are each a part of. The meta story, the great story, the story of creation, the story of redemption, the story of love and embrace and welcome that we receive as we enter into your presence every single day. The story of grace. We thank you for the story of this church and the story of every individual in the church. But Lord, may those stories not be anchor points that hold us back, but be a different type of anchor that inspires us as we look upon them, to rehearse your mighty acts, to rehearse your mighty works in our life, so that we can be catalysed forward to be all that you want us to be, to do the things you want us to do, and to see your name glorified in this place. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.